Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Ryujinx series. Who's Nintendo suing and why are they suing them this week? And we've got over so many different videos in regards to Suyu, Yuzu, Ryujinx, all of the different emulators, as well as all of the different DMCA takedown notifications Nintendo's been sending out, even striking some videos on YouTube from popular emulation tutorial makers and device reviewers. And it has always been like this. I know it seems like Nintendo has no chill in 2024, but they've had no chill since the 80s. So today we're going to be talking about what's currently going on with Nintendo, and then kind of do a history lesson, because obviously Yuzu and Suyu are completely gone. Ryujinx has ceased development. Nintendo's making a full court press like they were trying to do in the 80s and early 90s, but right now they're winning a lot more than they used to, and that is the reality of it. It's always been like this when it comes to Nintendo. They've been suing people since they basically started as a video game maker, and we want to talk about how that kind of informs their current decision-making process. Now, this is a copy of The Legend of Zelda on the Famicom Disk System, and the reason I'm showing you this is because of the manual that is inside of it. Nintendo obviously printed the manual and they distribute with the game, but back in 1989, they sued Blockbuster Entertainment Corp, you know, the place that you used to go into and rent games if you're old enough to remember that, because they were photocopying game manuals. And honestly, making a photocopy of a manual and then distributing it would be copyright infringement, because Nintendo did make the manual. All of their copyright information and all of their images are contained within, so this would be a situation in which it wouldn't be allowed. But Nintendo was never actually doing this because of the manual inside of the game. They were upset for a completely different reason. It all comes down to revenue and income streams. Just to kind of show you guys that Nintendo's been doing this for almost the last 40 years now. Blockbuster accused Nintendo of being upset because they were excluded from the Computer Software Rental Amendments Act, allowing the rental of games. Nintendo was trying to make it so that you could not rent games at a Blockbuster or any sort of other homespun rental place where you'd get your VHS, those mom and pop shops back in the day. They did not want this to be allowed, so they basically just decided to figure out how they could sue Blockbuster and give them a little bit of pain. And even back then, a journalist described this as doing something that is legally right but is not right. And that's what we see Nintendo doing today. Sure, they may have the legal right to sue people doing sheet music for different Nintendo games, but morally, is it what they really should be doing? That's probably not what they should be doing at all. And you'll see here Howard Lincoln in 1993 criticized rentals, saying that it basically takes money out of Nintendo's pocket. And that's what Nintendo always seems to be doing when they file these lawsuits. They feel like somebody else is making money when they should be making money, so they go ahead and sue everyone to try to stop it. Like the current Palworld lawsuit right now, it's not so much that you're throwing a ball into the game, it's that Nintendo feels like somebody is eating their own lunch. They are taking money out of their pocket, and they just don't like that whatsoever. So in Palworld's instance, it doesn't really make much sense other than to be a punishment. Now, on the flip side of this, any of the Nintendo Switch carts that would allow you to play your games in a manner in which Nintendo doesn't feel allowed, this makes sense that Nintendo does go after them, and they may have a legal basis to do so, where there would still be that reverse engineering clause in the DMCA that may allow for these things to actually be permissible. It really isn't decided in any one direction, but Nintendo obviously loves doing this. And of course, with Ryujinx being the most current Switch emulator to go down and not continue development, clearly Nintendo is winning at this. They've taken 3 different Nintendo Switch emulators as well as a 3DS emulator completely off the market in 2024. Sure, you can still find them and download them, but developments are not going to continue, and even though they are mostly fully featured, it is still a Nintendo win as far as everyone is concerned. But let's move over to Nintendo's suing Galoob, the maker of the game Genie, and I will leave a link to this article down below because it is quite interesting, gives some information that I'm not going to really go over in the video because it's tangential at best. But Nintendo went after Game Genie back in the day because they thought this was also an infringing product, and this decision actually gives us a lot of the abilities that we currently use when we're talking about game preservation, game modification, things such as that. Nintendo felt that the Game Genie was infringing, and the courts decided that it was not, and this is actually a very big deal. Had they decided it was infringing, it would mean that you can't make any sort of temporary modifications to your games, because obviously what the Game Genie does is not permanent. It's just patching different RAM addresses to give you more lives in the game, give you invulnerability, just basically patching the code on the fly, and when you turn the power off, all of those patches are completely removed, leaving the software exactly how you found it. And Galoob ended up winning $15 million in in settlement money from Nintendo. So this is a different thing than a game manual, of course, but it still goes to show that Nintendo is constantly doing things like this and always has been. This also was cited under Sega vs. Accolade as fair use, so this is a case law that definitely gets brought up time and time again, the Nintendo vs. Galoob settlement. And this is just more evidence of how notorious Nintendo is for this, because Galoob basically preemptively sued Nintendo to ask courts to say that this was allowed, and that's exactly what they did find. And again, it is just a track record of Nintendo constantly doing things such as this. There was a reference to a Midway court case, but they found that that upgrade kit actually contained copyright material, so it wouldn't be permissible, where something like the Game Genie contains absolutely 0 bits of code that would have been written by Nintendo. If you take something like Super Mario World, you pop a Game Genie on it, and I know we're talking NES versus SNES, it's just the footage I had at hand, and you modified the game contents in RAM to give yourself unlimited lives, that would be totally fine. And they basically just talk about skipping forward pages in a book, and that's how sometimes these laws are made. The judge in this case is talking about physical books, so talk about video games. But they're saying that having paid Nintendo a fair return, the consumer may experiment with the product and create new variations at their will. And you will see here again, this is something that then again got brought up in the DMCA about circumvention, which leads us right back into what Nintendo's arguing about with Switch emulation, whether or not there is technological circumvention going on in their protection to make sure that the game that you bought works on the Switch that you bought. That is how far these court cases can go back. A case in 1990 about the Game Genie informed the DMCA law written in 2000, and that is law that Nintendo is currently referencing when they talk about Switch emulation. So you can see here, that is over 34 years from the Galoob case to something like the Switch emulation cases we've seen lately. And that's not to talk about the things that Nintendo kind of was involved in but wasn't involved in at all. Portal 64, the demake of Portal on the Nintendo 64 hardware. You know full well Valve is cool. They let people come in, modify Half-Life, remake it, and as long as you are good about it, Valve kind of just lets you play around with what they have. But obviously it was Valve that asked the developer of Portal 64 to stop production of it. I'm sure that is down to the fact that Portal 64 used the Nintendo 64 SDK and would have technically contained some code written by Nintendo, because if you use the SDK, there's definitely going to be a footprint there. And even if Nintendo wasn't directly involved in this, their reputation certainly preceded themselves, and that's why something like Portal 64 would end up ceasing development. And the developer on this even said that they could move it over to a more modern SDK, but they wanted to try to work on something new. But that is how notorious Nintendo is. Valve didn't like this just because they knew that Nintendo's lawyers might start sniffing around, and it would open up a whole can of worms they probably just didn't rightly so want to get involved in themselves, because it's not like Valve is doing this work for the Nintendo 64. They stand to gain nothing and stood to lose a lot if Nintendo actually involved themselves. And you gotta remember, this is the same Nintendo that had the YouTube creator program where they would basically say they wanted 40% of all of your revenue if you made any videos about Nintendo, or else they could and would copyright strike them. And that is just wild, and just goes to show that track record of Nintendo 100% just nickel and diming everything. They do not want to feel like they are losing a penny to their fans, and that's a situation where they just love to go after stuff like this. And while it is totally fine to use emulation, we know it's all permitted, it's totally fine to teach something like using an emulator, they are still going after channels showing these things. So if you're going to make a Nintendo emulation video, I recommend not showing any Nintendo games, because they're not actually striking the videos because of the emulation. They're saying copyright infringement because the games use Nintendo properties. This is just like them going after Blockbuster back in the day for photocopying manuals. They can't actually enforce what they want, which is you not to understand how to use emulation, so they use an end run tactic to try to basically get their own way. Retro Game Core here has had 2 videos removed with 2 different copyright strikes, one on backing up physical media, the other on emulation, because it showed Nintendo properties. So they know that they really can't legally ban these devices, and they can't ban emulation, but they can make it very difficult for you to talk about it. And it all traces back to Nintendo of America versus Blockbuster in 1989. Nintendo did not like the fact that game rentals were allowed, and they felt like they were losing money even though Blockbuster bought every single one of those copies and Nintendo had made their first sale cash. So what do? They found a new way to sue Blockbuster just to make them feel a little bit of pain, and that's what Nintendo seems to like to do, make you feel the pain. So as we talk about Switch emulation and what Nintendo's doing with all the DMCAs in 2024, do be aware that this traces all the way back almost to the Reagan era, and if you weren't alive back then, it was a very long time ago. For sure that we're done. If you have any questions, leave them down below, but I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.